Ryan Loy said that he learned something as a student in FFA back in Plano, Texas years ago, and he has carried it with him today. Too many people do not know enough about agriculture, and he is trying to do something about it. Hi, I'm Dave Price, and this is the American Farmland Owner Podcast. What Ryan Loy said really is kind of our unofficial mission of what we're trying to do here on the podcast. We talk to thoughtful people about relevant matters to farmland so we can all learn something. Now, we should say, before we get into this conversation, Ryan is Dr. Ryan Loy, and he's an extension ag economist and assistant professor with the University of Arkansas Division of Agriculture. These days, he's been tracking something that has his attention and his concerns. That is the rise in Chapter 12 bankruptcies. We're going to get into what's happening and why during this conversation, but let's begin by learning more about Ryan and his early days in Plano. Let's start with growing up in Plano.
Yeah.
You got time in Texas, you got time in Oklahoma later on. But will you talk a little bit about kind of the younger years, your connection to FFA, what
Absolutely.
that taught you, what you learned from that, because I feel like that probably shapes who you are today.
Big time. And I really appreciate you bringing that up. And I'm glad you knew it was from Plano. Most of the time when I say that, people are like, where's Plano? But yes, I grew up in Plano, Texas. And for those that don't know, it's just a suburb, just a little bit north of Dallas. Growing up there, it's a big city. The high school I went to, my graduating class had 1,600 kids. So it's a big, big city school. And so, I grew up with no connection to agriculture. My dad is an engineer, my mom did some law stuff, um, but I never had any connection to agriculture. And when I started, figuring out what I wanted to do in terms of being a part of school and those sorts of things, some of the extracurricular activities, I knew I wouldn't cut it as an athlete. I never was. I was never good at the team sports. But I had a great, I took, an ag course in the beginning of high school, my first semester, first year, and I hit it off with the FFA teacher, and her and I just kind of it was a good relationship, and so she brought me on into FFA. I didn't know anything about it at the time, but it sounded interesting. And so what I did was I did radio broadcasting for folks outside of Texas FFA. That's literally what we're doing right now, except it's just students that put together a script and we compete based on that. And so I did that for all of my years in FFA. I judged livestock and I showed animals as well. And really what I found in doing that was, even though I was a big city kid, I grew up with people who, and even myself at the time, didn't understand what it took to get food to the grocery store, what it took to get that food from the field to our house even. Didn't understand that. And so as I got into FFA a lot more, I learned more about this and I started to look at this and say, I think that, the agriculture sector is really misunderstood, especially from people in bigger cities who don't have that kind of exposure. And so one of my motivations and my biggest motivation was, hey, I want to be able to go out and relay this information to people who aren't ag adjacent or involved in ag at all to make it make sense to them and to reiterate where food comes from and how difficult it is. And so that really shaped the position I'm in now. I went to Oklahoma State after that and then came here. So it's been a really good, and I appreciate FFA for everything it's done for me. So.
It seems like the learning curve's pretty steep. I too I didn't grow up on a farm, grew up in Southern Illinois. You joked about when people said, oh, where's Plano? I grew up in a city, Belleville, Illinois. It's about 45,000 people, just east of St. Louis. Typically, when I talk to people, unless I'm back home, I usually just say I'm from St. Louis.
Exactly. I
If
do the
they
same.
care at all, they'll ask, oh, whereabouts or whatever. It's just a lot simpler than saying, no disrespect to my hometown of 45,000 people, but if you don't know it, you don't know it.
That's
So
right.
it kind of saves us the conversation. But anyway, so my town, ag wasn't super heavy within the city limits, but all along it
Right.
and surrounded by corn. And Growing up, you don't really, you drive past it, maybe visiting friends in the next town or something, but you don't understand the process. And I'm reminded, since I've been living in Iowa for the past 20 plus years, we have a longtime senator here, Chuck Grassley, who still farms back in Northeast Iowa. And he talks about one of the challenges when you're trying to get these federal politicians putting together federal ag policy is that so few of them have any connection at all to ag. He's still an active farmer, and his son primarily runs their farm, and grandson helps too. But so the learning curve is so steep, and I feel like so many of the things we're going through right now is just completely foreign to most of us, including me, who's tried to immerse myself in this industry the last several years to try to figure out what's going on.
That's right. I would agree wholeheartedly. It's just one of the learning curve is very steep, and if you're not exposed to it all the time, and then you hear about something in the news, it's not going to hit the same, right? It doesn't mean as much, right, to some of those who aren't exposed, and maybe they even from that perspective, there's a misunderstanding of the magnitude in terms of how big this problem is, right, and what it really means. It's a very interesting thing, and that's, a big reason why. It's just saying, hey, there's so many people disconnected. I come from a city where 90% of those people are disconnected, including myself. And so how can we kind of bridge that gap a little bit better?
And I want to talk to you about bankruptcies. That's why I wanted to reach out to you to figure out what the heck's going on in Arkansas specifically. But we've seen these Chapter 12 bankruptcies going up. I also wanted, though, just based on your background, I think, when we were talking about learning curves, so many of us, maybe it literally wasn't the first time we've ever heard supply chain once we got into COVID. But I think the
Right.
familiarity with, oh crap, this is what happens when there's a kink in the system. Now that we've, so we're what, 5 years in or so when this really started, almost 5.5 years now. Is that, where are we in that terms? And the reason I'm thinking about this is that I was talking to a congresswoman from Iowa this past week, and she was talking about, she visited an ag setting, and she's talking to the farmer there, and a lot of the animal proteins that they get on the containers, on the bags, it's all written in Chinese because so much of that comes from China. And she
Absolutely.
is saying we got to get a better handle on this, and that makes our food system vulnerable potentially if things go sideways with China when you're talking about national security matters. But that whole, maybe the ag side of the supply chain, where do you see things?
Absolutely. So, that's a very interesting question. And when we're talking about the ag side of the supply chain, there's heavy importance on both the import and the export sides of that, right? And we're looking at the import side, it's definitely, looking at what does it take to produce our crop, right? Or to produce the animal. But we have to import our inputs for that. And a lot do come from China. Some come from other sources, but it's not here, right? And so when you start to look at, around the COVID timeframe, this starts a little bit sooner than COVID, but it was kind of a precursor. When we're looking at the trade wars that, kind of 2018 around that time frame, that's really where we started seeing how I'm going to use this word, it's a little, vulnerable our supply chain can be in terms of what we rely on for other countries. Now, just to kind of point this out, other countries also rely on us for very important things too. So it's not just a one-way street all
Sure.
the time. But in terms of fertilizer, if I can take that as an example, we rely on everybody else. And
Mhm.
so you have the trade wars coming in. There's going to be, where I'm talking the first trade war, 2018, right? There's uncertainty surrounding that. And if there's a good way to sum up how this supply chain reacts and what happens, is, the term sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Markets do not follow that rule, right? So if there's even so much as a little bit of an uncertainty that's added to that, well, you're going to see those prices react to it. And so whether even the supply chain is perfect, if there's even a hint of some sort of that uncertainty, especially from that input side, those prices are going to react because the suppliers don't know what's the supply I'm going to have. We need to charge as if we need to charge as if this is going to be a more scarce resource than it was the year before that, if that makes sense. And so really what you see is a lot of just price reactions from these changes, from whether it was policy set out by other countries or ourselves in the first trade war, then COVID happens. Nobody's working. How do you even get it there? And we come off of that, and we're still working out some hiccups from that, from the pandemic, and figuring out how to make a more resilient supply chain. You know, less reliance on more AI, more computer
Hmm.
approaches when it comes to point A to point B sometimes. Like that's going to be necessary in terms of if that were to ever happen again, we have to have a more resilient supply chain. And now what we're seeing is we came off the first trade war, we had the pandemic, a lot of government assistance came out and helped, and we dropped pretty consistently in terms of financial stress. And since then, we just haven't had the commodity prices that justify the inputs that the farmers are paying. And that's for several reasons. And all boils down to that supply chain. If we're talking about imports, inputs, fertilizer, post-COVID, the Russian-Ukraine war, huge, huge impact on that, right? Because again, they don't know where it's going to head. But at the same time, that was benefit for our export wheat prices because those two countries
Yeah.
grow the most wheat in that area. So that was a benefit on our export market, but to actually grow that crop, it became more expensive. And that was one point I forgot to make earlier is that on the export side of things, when we're talking about our ag exports, and if I'm going to pick on Arkansas because that's where I'm at, we're extremely export heavy, extremely, and we're row crop heavy too. So that's another thing, if I can compare Arkansas to Oklahoma, those are the major differences. They do grow row crops, but they're majority livestock, whereas it's completely opposite here. So we really rely on those export markets, specifically China. So if we're taking soybeans, for example, let's say on average it's somewhere around $20 billion worth of soybeans that get sent to China each year just from us. But we've seen that share steadily kind of decline since the
Hmm.
2018 trade war. And you ask, well, why? Well, China has an invested interest, if you think about this from a purely business perspective, not politics, nothing else, just a purely business perspective. They want to buy the cheapest input. They want to buy the cheapest commodity because if it's a commodity, not saying it is, but it should be the same quality. That's the idea of a commoditized good, right? And so they go, well, we have a better relationship with Brazil. We don't have tariffs on them. We've got basically a free trade with them. We're just going to go to them. And it's cheaper. They harvest earlier than we do. And they don't have to get into the politics to the quite same way that they do when they trade with us.
And as you know, and this is what people have warned me about having these discussions, that once you establish that relationship, especially if you've lost it to somebody else, it can be really hard to then get it back, which is why you then had some people sweating out what this tariff war 2.0, which is even bigger, quite a bit bigger than the first version of this, and what could be at stake if this doesn't go the way the president thinks it will.
Yes, sir. And in terms of the politics, I'm not a politician myself. People who get paid much more than I do and have, all those sorts of things, they're the ones with the answers. But if I'm looking at data, and the biggest thing is that we we are not the only source of cheap fiber and fuel, right? Anymore. We could have been at one point, and we probably more likely were, especially the trade relationships we have. But Brazil has answered that call. Brazil can quickly shift acreage, right? We're landlocked. We're very much landlocked in terms of how much more we can expand in terms of agriculture production, right? But Brazil, they are not landlocked to the same degree we are. They have a different input cost, right? They have a better relationship with China. Those input costs are a little bit cheaper. Their labor is much cheaper. And they're, looking at the data, they're in terms of just output per acre, they're as efficient as us. And so everything besides corn, and I can provide those numbers too. But really the important part is that they answered the call and there's no incentive for China to move off of that, right? And so that when you ask yourself, you look at it and say, well, how do you incentivize these countries to trade with us again? And one of the ways you do that is to say, hey, we're trustworthy. We'll always deliver and our quality is always going to be good, which is true for us. But where I look at it and say, how far does that take us?
Okay, so I think this gives a good foundational setup here to talk about bankruptcies, which is a tough conversation, but some of the economic factors pre-COVID are relevant and unfortunately apparent again, right? And that's some of this pressure, this financial pressure that some of these producers are feeling, and maybe that's why we're seeing these Chapter 12 filings going up.
Absolutely. And so, from when we're talking about the Chapter 12 bankruptcies, that is just going to be just for farms, right? And so any numbers that I'm reporting, I'm likely understating them because just because you're in a farm, you could be in a Chapter 7, which is a full liquidation, depending on where you're at, right, financially. But one thing I can tell with Chapter 12 is that specifically farms, right?
And
So,
let me pause you 1 second, if I might.
yes,
Sorry to interrupt you, but one
please.
thing that I failed to do in this setup was 7 versus 12 for those not familiar with it.
Absolutely. So 7 is just the full liquidation, and I'm not a lawyer, but I'm pretty sure that's not a choice. Like there, you have to. And then Chapter 12 is voluntary to restructure debt under 12.5 million. So some farms are forced to liquidate under Chapter 12 to bring that debt level down. But that's not as widespread as somebody just saying, "Hey, I see the writing on the wall. I need to restructure this debt. I need to be under a different payment plan to get out from under this." Because the whole goal of Chapter 12 is to make sure that you can sustain and stay in business, right? That's the whole reason it was created. So these are folks who are still farming, still want to farm. They're not, losing when we're talking from the Chapter 12 side. But if we're looking at Chapter 12s, nationally, let's start with Arkansas. In the first, we're right on the margin for what Arkansas typically has. If we're comparing 2020 for the 12 months period leading up. So how I'm reporting these numbers is the from April 1st of the leading year to March 31st of the next year. So if I say 2025 numbers, that's ending March 31st, 2025 from April 1, 2024. So if I can just take our 2025 number, which is 15 in the state, and I can compare that to, let's just say 2020, where we're talking about these high, expenses, or even 2019, that was 14 and 13. So when you're looking at those numbers, you're like, okay, we've already kind of hit that mark.
Hmm.
And so what does that mean? So let's give some more context. Let's look at 2024. And Arkansas alone, that was 10, right? But 23 and 22 was 8, 2023 was 3. So what you really see is kind of that big drop after a lot of that government assistance. And now what we're starting to see is those numbers just creep back up, right? Because exactly what you said, those issues that we were also dealing with in 2018, 2019, leading up to COVID, we're still dealing with those now in terms of, the commodity prices that they're getting paid is not justifying the input costs. And it's not the farmer's fault, right? They're doing everything they can do, pre-booking, marketing, budgeting, everything. But if it doesn't pencil, it doesn't pencil. And that's really what we've seen. On a national level, if we're just looking at quarter 1, and I think this is really the number that is pretty staggering to me. Just in the first quarter of this year, so the first 3 months of this year compared to the first 3 months of 2024, on a national level, we were at 45 Chapter 12s. This year, in the first 3 months, we're at 88. And so when you look at that, folks can say, and totally right to say, well, don't know if there's a trend there yet. And
Hmm.
that's correct. But the important thing to point out is over none of these years has that doubled like that. In terms of even that the magnitude of the numbers during 2018, 19, in the first trade war and leading up to the pandemic, the magnitude was worse. That actual doubling of the number, I asked myself, why is that? And that really is the whole basis of the newsletter, trying to kind of understand really what it is. And it boils down to our export markets and our import markets as to in terms of where we're at right now.
And when you're looking at Arkansas versus the country, the you have something like a quarter of these Chapter 12 filings, right?
In the 8th district. So Arkansas is part of the 8th U.S. Circuit Court District, which you're going to get me. I meant to write it down. It's a couple of, so the funny part about it, Missouri's in there, I believe Iowa's in there, Minnesota's in there. I'm missing one more. I think it was South Dakota. I don't think North Dakota is. I can't, excuse me, please
Yeah,
excuse
yeah,
me. I
yeah.
can't. But the point that I want to make there is that um, of that 8th district, but what that really tells me is that we're the only southern state in that group,
Hmm.
and Midwest faces an entirely different set of risks than we face, right? Whether it's weather, whether it's the type of crops we grow, the farmland that we have, those sorts of things. It's just much different. Not saying it's for better or for worse, but it's different. And so when we're comparing ourselves against Midwest and northern states, right, it's a kind of an apples and oranges comparison there. But I would always suspect that the southern state in a group would probably be leading that number, just because, again, we're talking about the unique risks that we face in terms of production, the extreme weather that we have, everything in between that could go wrong on a farm will go wrong on a farm in the south, you know? And again, everybody can do everything that they're supposed to do correctly, and sometimes just out of their control.
All right, I'm going to put you on the spot here, and I've asked a few folks since we started doing this podcast almost 2 years ago, as I try to open my eyes to this new world. The one, and I'm talking to you from Iowa, where we're corn and beans. Obviously, we've got tons of hogs too, but when you're looking at crops, you're talking corn and beans. And when I wonder about this and, when I meet these folks and what they go through and they're sweating this out, it seems like year after year after year, do we have to come up with some system to where we can better support folks transitioning out of those to something else? When I hear about all of these things working against you and they're phenomenal at it takes fewer people and they can do it so much more efficiently than the generation before. And it's like, how much better can these people get? I realize every generation is so much better than the first, but than the one before it. But do we have to reform our system so that Brazil has some inherent advantages? And I'm not trying to diss our country or by any means any of our
No, of
producers, but they have certain inherent advantages in the climate right
course.
now. So do we have to find a way to prioritize other stuff?
That's a really great question and a difficult one, and I really appreciate that you asked that. It's tough, right? So here's how I'll try. I don't even know if this answers your question, but I'm going to try to use this as an example. Let's say that I have a massive farm, a couple thousand acres, if not tens of thousands, and I historically have always grown some rotation of rice, corn, soybeans, whether it's on different, but that's what I've always grown.
Hmm.
Well, a lot of your farm and a lot of what you do, and the reason you farm so many acres is to try to capture that economies of scale, right?
Hmm.
Especially in those big commoditized crops. It's extremely difficult to say, I need to switch somewhere else now, right? Because of how much that is being put into this and how much is being grown. It's difficult to find another crop that you could grow that much of and still have a downstream market for. And, we still have other markets for our commodities we grow now. It's just, again, that uncertainty in the market is what's kind of making everybody's hair stand up on the back of their head. And then the market's going to react to that and the price will tumble, right? Um, you know, in terms of changing our approach, that would be really difficult to do on a widespread scale. But what I will say is that I've seen smaller producers that grow specialty crops,
Hmm.
they have, shifted to more contract-based growing, where I'm not going to market this myself. I have a downstream contract, so I'm growing this, I'm guaranteed a price.
Hmm.
Some folks can do that with rice and some can do it with soybeans, but those aren't as widespread that would fill everybody's need, right? Um, it's a difficult thing. We have good farm support, especially after, not politic related, but just highlighting the farmer aspect of the one big
Hmm.
beautiful bill. The farmers got a good deal there, and they did in terms of updating that support that they need in times like this. The one issue being, though, is that a lot of those don't kick in until 2026.
Hmm.
So one of the biggest questions is that, well, yes, this is great and this is a win for farmers. How do you get there? Right. And so a lot of these numbers and what we're looking at for the export markets this year, I think that'll be a difficult road. Don't think I answered your question, but to sum it up,
Yeah,
the point I'm trying
yeah,
to
it's
make
tough.
is that it's difficult. It would be very
Yeah.
difficult for a big farmer to make that shift.
Okay, and I'm sorry, I didn't mean to segue you away from your neighbors in Arkansas because obviously we've got to figure out what's going on there, what makes the financial pressure so tough right there. And one of the things you also talk about is this lag effect, right? Um, Maybe talk about that a little bit about because that lag can maybe color the situation because from the process of actually filing and getting it resolved and all that kind of stuff. So how are you viewing that?
That's it, that's interesting. What I meant by in terms of the lag effect is that this is a good indicator of financial stress, obviously, right? You wouldn't be doing it unless it was, but that's not a decision that you just make waking up one day, right? This is a repeated thing of, and I think you hit it perfectly earlier, where you said that people are just trying to make it one more year, one more year, one
Mhm.
more year. And I think what we've are starting to see, and I will admit this is a full opinion. There's nothing in the data that would tell me this in terms of a trend yet. But what I would assume is that a lot of this is going to be from the producers who say, all right, I made it through this year. I had to burn up some of my liquidity, some of my working capital. I'll make it to next year, and hopefully things will get better. We get to next year, same situation. And that's what we've seen for the last 3 years. Coming off of COVID, that's really what we've seen. And there have been, some times of higher prices and the farmers, they're marketing and doing whatever they can. Um, but the point being is that I think what we're seeing is starting to just fall off and fall off more and more and more and more. And I think that's the trend. And in terms of the lag effect, this somebody filing in the first quarter of 2025 is not just because of financial stress in the first quarter of 2025.
Yeah.
This is from the first quarter of 2024 through to this time, right? Or even 2023, depending on how much working capital you had and how much you were willing to burn, right? And so those are the big things when we're looking at that.
So, and I appreciate that you're always wanting more and more data, but, and you also talked about you don't want to jump to conclusions about stuff. So you've got first quarter numbers and clearly there'll be more to come. What is based on your experience, does this tell you that this is more likely a trend and not a good trend, but a trend rather than a short-term blip?
I think so. And it could be a short-term blip in terms of, hey, some things have gotten better and it's immediate relief, and then
Hmm.
maybe folks can get out of it quicker, or they don't have to file like they thought they would. If you didn't file, if you're a row crop producer and you didn't file in the first 2 quarters, well, it's less likely that you would do it in the third or fourth because you already have the loan and you're working. So it'd be more than likely that next quarter that year. And so from that perspective, there's nothing in the markets where we stand today. I can wake up tomorrow and it be completely different, as we've all learned. There's nothing in the markets that tells me right now that there is upside potential to turn this around in a year's time frame. And so if we're looking at that, and when you look at the data and the graphs, especially in that newsletter, if you have it, it kind of looks like a roller coaster. And so again, you saw it trend up all the way to COVID because of all the, the issues we were dealing with before. Then COVID hit, it basically reached a maximum point. Pandemic assistance came in and it dropped all the way down. And we've kind of stayed low, but now we've started to see that climb back up slowly, maybe. But like I said, what really got me looking at this and the reason why I wanted to run a newsletter on it was just saying, well, why in the world is there double the number of chapter 12s in this quarter versus last quarter? And that really leads me to believe that of course, this is not an easy decision for anybody, but that this is not a instant choice, right? This is how long can we sustain, and now we have to, and that's really the position they're in.
Is there anything on a federal level? We've seen one big beautiful that's gone through that had clearly had some things that could be potential benefits longer term once those kick in for producers. But is there anything more immediate that's going to have to be done on a federal level to help to get folks through 25?
Well, I know that there is some, and I don't have the details in front of me, and I should, but there is, some supplemental disaster relief payments that will come out
Mm-hmm.
for him.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, part into that the folks did have a lot of weather issues and all those sorts of things and do need to be compensated. But also I think that that might be some, from the politics perspective, their way to get farms to next year to reap the benefits of the updated support programs.
Well, Ryan, we really appreciate thanks for the insight and thanks for the background on this.
Thank you so much.
Let's hope that something kind of changes conditions here so that this doesn't become a longer term trend for some of these folks.
That's right. And I talk a lot about this and I appreciate talking about it, but want all the listeners to know it's not something that I don't think any one of us wants to talk about. I wish I could come here and report that they're down historically, right? That would make my day. But if I can, bring attention to this and help the farmer, that's the goal.
All right. Thank you. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
You can learn more about Dr. Ryan Loy in our profile piece about him. It's in the American Farmland Owner Weekly newsletter. It's free. It comes out every week. You can get it straight to your inbox, or you can just go to the website every week, AmericanFarmlandOwner.com. Either way, it's the place where landowners get their news. Thanks for checking us out this week, and thanks for caring about the future of our farmland.